I'll just take a brief moment to mention the Women Business and the Law program. We cover discriminatory laws across the world in 143 economies and territories, and we're expanding that, I think, as very soon to 186. And we cover discriminatory laws that impact on women's economic empowerment and their women's ability to get a job, to grow and start a business. We have a free and openly accessible database, and we publish a report every 2 years. So this is our last report, and we'll be launching our new report in September of this year. So we hope to see you again at our launch events. And I'd ask everyone to look at our website and to see how you can become a contributor to this project, because we depend on your support to get this important information. But I don't want to take up too much time on this occasion, because we'd love to get this exciting and stimulating debate moving. So I'm going to hand over to Joanne now, and just one last word: make sure you all vote. All right, thank you.
Hi, good morning. Nice to see everyone. Before I begin introducing our illustrious panel, and illustrious it is, I want to ask you all to make sure to vote now. And if you haven't voted, I'm going to tell you how to do so. You have to visit the website, www.ndi.org/WBG. And while I introduce everyone, hopefully, if you haven't voted, please vote now, because what we're going to do is we're going to have the results pop up on the screen. We're going to hear from our panelists. We're going to have you vote after and see if things have changed. All right. Everyone has the website and knows how to vote? Anyone need clarification? Everyone good? Yes? 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 Okay, I'm going to move on. Okay, so to my left and to your right, we have two incredible panelists who are going to argue on the side of economics and economic empowerment and how that can lead to gender equality. On the very far left, my very far left, is Linda Scott. She has been working in the field of economic development for decades, and the impact of multinational companies and how they operate on gender. Is that right? Is that okay? All right. She has a long and illustrious career in this. She is currently someone who has her own blog called the Double X Economy, which is syndicated by many others. She is also the World Chair for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the University of Oxford's Said Business School. So that's our first panelist. Our second panelist is Irene Khan, who is the Director General of the International Development Law Organization, and she is the first woman to hold this office. She too has had an illustrious career dealing with issues of gender and human rights. On my right, on your left, we start first with Shari Bryan. Shari is the Vice President at the Washington, D.C.-based National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. She has been in the world of global development for several decades. She began a couple of decades ago by analyzing the impact of democracy programs in Southern Africa and how gender plays into that. So that sort of launched her illustrious career. And last but certainly not least is Sandra Pepera, who is recently relocated here from the UK, so welcome on all sorts of levels. She is now the Director for Gender for NDI, but she is a career diplomat and international development professional who is going to take a valiant effort to make the argument that political empowerment is the way begin. Has anyone voted? Yes, yes, yes? No? It's not working. It's very slow. Okay, so we'll take we're going to have a couple of remarks first. Yes, so let's have those remarks and we'll see if we can't get someone, can we get someone to look and see what's going on? Sure. The web address is www.ndi.org/W, B as in boy, G as in girl. Okay. I know there are more than 26 people in this room, so let's go, people. You all, you still have a little bit more time. I don't want to really start until more people have logged in, so let me turn to you.
Well, we're going to start with economics because they're getting most of the votes.
Okay.
69 or so. Sorry.
But the questions are, I'm going to say the remarks first. Oh, we can do it that way. That's fine. That's fine. No problem. Okay. So I'm going to turn it over to remarks first before we start questions.
My name is Irene Khan. I've been a human rights advocate for many years, where I've advocated for the indivisibility of rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, and political and civil rights, integrating them together. So I find myself in an awkward position having to argue for economic empowerment. In the real world, of course, citizenship has not been backed up by evidence. This is not the real world. This is not the real world. This is Washington, D.C. And in Washington, D.C., we do strange things. One of which is to argue as to why we have to focus on women's economic empowerment. And I will say for a number of good reasons. There are a number of good reasons why we should focus on women's economic empowerment. First of all, look at the gender inequalities in terms of paid and unpaid work, in terms of gender blindness for unpaid care work, for inequalities in access to resources, economic resources, or social resources such as education, or economic resources such as land or credit. All these things actually reinforce women's subordinate status in society. And that's why it's important to focus on economic empowerment. They leave women dependent on the men in their family to take care of them. It means that women are disadvantaged in the marketplace, which reinforces again their lack of strategic agency. Empowerment is about agency. It is about the ability to make your strategic choices. And women cannot do that if they do not have the economic empowerment. Secondly, women's economic empowerment has positive implications for the well-being of their families and therefore for future generations. And thirdly, of course, it has been proven that women's economic empowerment matters for reducing poverty because sometimes investing in women means investing in poor households, where even where the woman is a secondary income earner, it can actually help increase the overall income of the family. And certainly where the woman is the main income earner, it's incredibly important for her. And finally, investing in women's economic empowerment is good for economic growth. And given that we are in a city where policymakers are obsessed with economic growth, an argument that investing in women's economic growth produces results in terms of the overall economy is a powerful incentive for policymakers to bring about change. Change, you have to incentivize them, and I think this argument, and there's plenty of evidence to show how investing in women helps the economy. Women's participation, there's evidence that where women's participation in the labor force grew fastest, the economy experienced the largest reduction in poverty rates. When women farmers can access the resources they need, their production increases, making sure that their family is less hungry and that food security is ensured. When women own property and earn money from it, they may have more bargaining power in the market but also certainly in their own homes. And this in turn can reduce their vulnerability to violence, to HIV infection, and to a whole range of other risks. And when women have access to time-saving technologies, whether it is a foot-pedaled water pump or whether it's a washing machine, we've seen what happens to the economy. So there are many different ways in which women's economic empowerment actually makes a difference for women. It's a matter of social justice and human rights. It makes a difference for the future, so it's a matter of sustainable development, and it certainly makes a difference to the country and to the global economy as well. However, the point to underline is that this cannot be seen only as an issue of increasing women's access to the economy. It is not just about any kind of growth, it is about the quality of growth. Women just having access to the labor market is not enough. Women must have access to quality jobs. That's where the challenge lies, because empowerment is not only about income. Empowerment is about giving women the capability to make those strategic choices. And that is where it requires a particular approach to dealing with the economy. It cannot only be left to the market. It is about rights, it is about dignity, it is about agency of women. Finally, I would like to underline that economic empowerment can be a very powerful entry point. If I look at my own country, I come from Bangladesh, a country where women have had the right to vote and participate in political life for 65 years, where our leader of the government, our Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition have consistently been women for the last 20, 25 years. But change in Bangladesh for women have not come through that. Change for women in Bangladesh have come through two major economic initiatives. One has been the microcredit movement, which was born in Bangladesh and acknowledged by the Nobel Prize to Professor Yunus there. And the second was, and is, of course, the garment industry, which has given many women the possibility to put their foot on the rung, on the ladder of employment, even if it is at the lowest rung. It has actually opened up other kinds of opportunities for them. And I rest my case with that. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce Shari Bryan, who's just going to say a few words before we get started on the debate.
Great, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think we're going to find that we are probably all in agreement in large part on many of the things that we're talking about today. I represent the National Democratic Institute, and we believe that women need to be politically empowered. As representing over 50% of the world's population, we believe that women need to be in political decision-making positions in government at all levels in order to affect the very issues that Irene was talking about regarding women's economic empowerment. So we start with the thesis that women's rights need to be enshrined and protected in a constitution and in the laws of a country. Those rights will then flow down to ensure that women have rights and access to property, rights and access to credit, and so on, and assurances to be able to get an education and health care. So in the way I look at it is the first step is the political empowerment and the enshrinement of political rights in a legal framework. But that needs to be achieved by women actively participating in politics. This is not going to happen without women advocating politically within their parties, within their governments, to change the constitutions and change the laws. And I think back about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the role that women played in South Africa was fundamental to ensuring that the South African Constitution enshrined very, very important, and at that time, extremely progressive rights in the South African Constitution. And that Constitution has been a model to women's rights around the world. South Africa also, importantly, women in South Africa lobbied for political rights and political access. And this was not done through legislation, but through efforts mainly in the ruling party, the ANC, where women lobbied for access to seats on parliamentary lists, which is a system that the party adopted that requires a zipper list system where every other person on the list for nominations for a parliamentary seat at the national and regional level are women. So women actually have an opportunity to run for office and to get into parliament. And I believe that now South Africa has, I did have it somewhere, 41% of the lower house is held by women and 35% of the upper house. And those numbers are quite remarkable, although they're not enough. I looked also at what happened, and I think most of you in the room are familiar with Tunisia's struggle over the last few years to end up with really one of probably the most progressive constitutions protecting women's rights in the world today. And that was done, again, achieved because women were politically active, advocating their political rights before parties, before the Constituent Assembly, and the bodies that developed and designed a legislative constitutional framework. Once women get into politics, they are able to enact legislation on a variety of issues that affect women and children, and I think ultimately addressing poverty and the bottom line. I don't think there's enough data out there now, and that's a weakness in the gender and democracy and political participation space, but there is evidence that suggests that once women reach around a 30% threshold in national legislatures, the laws that will come out of that legislature are focusing on women's rights and children's rights, and I think more studying needs to be done on that. But ultimately, we see the increase in the number of women in politics to definitely affect poverty alleviation, and I think also economic growth. Irene talked about the great success of microcredit in Bangladesh, and that is absolutely a remarkable story, not only in Bangladesh, but around the world. I would like to think about what progress can be made if there was actual access to real credit in countries like Bangladesh, if women were not prevented from going to a bank just like men to get loans, to be able to inherit property, the property that is oftentimes their husband's or their father's property, to use that property as collateral. Those types of things will put women ahead meteorically over the coming years. So we agree and support, I think, many of the propositions that Irene was making. We believe that in order to achieve those, though, you need equitable, strong representation in politics by women who are politically making political and legislative decisions. Thank you.
Apologies. Thank you, Shari. I'm going to see if these microphones work, because otherwise it's going to be a lot of jostling, moving back and forth. And one of my roles here is basically to ask some questions and move this along. So I am going to ask a question. Both sides will get to answer the same question, but I'm going to keep it to 5 minutes so we can get as many questions as possible in, because we have a little less than a half an hour to get these in. The economics team will go first, since we have 68% of the vote now. You can decide amongst yourselves who wants to take the question, okay? And I'm going to start with this question. In most of the world, no place is less safe for a woman than her own home, with more than 700 million women globally subject to physical or sexual violence at the hands of their husbands, boyfriends, or partners. This is a stunningly depressing fact in 2015. I want to ask each side to make a case as to how economic empowerment or political empowerment can reduce violence against women. So I don't know which of you would like to take that. If you can see if the microphone works from your, the light's going on. Okay. Can people hear?
Can you
Yes.
hear?
Yes. I'll stand.
Okay. A journalist once asked me what my definition was of an economically empowered woman. And it was one of those moments where I didn't know what I thought until I said so. But I still stick with this definition, and that is an economically empowered woman is a woman who can leave home if she has to. Because very, very often in this country, and especially in the very remote areas of the world where most of the world's extreme poor live, the idea of a law against violence, domestic violence, is really an abstraction. And communities themselves do not provide much support. Even the police can't be relied on. And there comes a moment when the only person a woman has is herself. And at that moment, she's got to be able to buy a bus ticket and get out of Dodge. So that's what I think.
5 seconds. I would like to take 5 seconds to tell you one anecdote. I visited South Africa in 2002, went to one of these centers where it was set up under their the Elimination of Violence Against Women Act to protect women who were seeking counseling, women victims of violence who were seeking counseling. And there I heard the story of Rosie, a poor South African woman who was beaten by her husband consistently until he beat her so badly that she died. Now, under South Africa's law, it is possible for any woman to go to a magistrate and seek a protection order and have her husband removed from her home. And I asked the counselor, why didn't Rosie go and get that protection order? And the counselor said to me, that is because she didn't have the bus fare to go to the nearest magistrate's court.
Thank you. I turn to the political team, whoever would like to take it first.
Well, thank you. I think none of us is going to allow that violence against women is in any way good or defensible, and there are various mechanisms, and I agree that we have to tackle this. But from our point of view, we would say that the collective action of women has a greater power when focused on lawmakers, when focused on service providers, and actually we have instances where we know that political caucuses, the first political caucus I think in Kazakhstan, one of the first issues that they took to that parliament was to ban early child marriage, which I think we would agree is a violence against women. We also have in Albania coalitions, parliamentary coalitions that have focused very much on lobbying for health matters with regards to women and better shares of the health budget towards women's issues, including violence against women. So I think for us, again, the intentionality, the power of collective action actually changes a whole policy framework. It is not as individualistic, if you like, in terms of Linda's point about a woman being able to afford to get out of Dodge, but the issue is, how do we change collectively the macro level policy environment that begins to address these issues and make the world a safer place for women?
Thank you. Shari, would you like to add something?
I would just also add that despite the fact that many laws and constitutions are not enforced, and I think that's a great challenge when we start talking about the legal empowerment or political empowerment of women, the fact that a country has adopted legislation or enshrined in their constitution certain protections puts them at a different level, I think, on the international stage, and allows for social movements, advocacy efforts, and should they have a rule of law that respects those rights, it enables society to advocate and challenge the lack of enforcement when that does take place. Without those laws, without those political changes in a society's legal or constitutional structure, there is nothing to advocate for. So we think having those protections enshrined in law, despite the fact that they may not be enforced as they should be by police or the judiciary, it is an important starting point.
Thank you. Okay, so our next question, and I'm going to start with the political team this time, ask them to take it first. Studies have shown that by strengthening women's property rights and their ability to control assets can improve their lives tremendously. I'd like you to cite an example, and then I'd like you to tell us why you consider this political empowerment. And we'll ask the same question in economic empowerment.
Well, I guess the example I'm most familiar with, and the one that gets cited a lot, is the case of Rwanda, where you have a parliament of 56% women or something, and they have actually driven through the political agenda on land rights. I know something about this because in a previous incarnation, I was head of the DFID program in Rwanda at a time when we were supporting the land tenure reform program, and it was quite clear that the, if you like, the advocacy and the weight of the women's lobby was driving this as much as the signals from the rest of government. So I think what we see in Rwanda over that period of time, over the last, let's say, 15 years post-genocide, has also been a tremendous improvement in the condition of women. Poverty has dropped dramatically in Rwanda, and we know that the most poor in Rwanda were the women. So I think that to the extent that you can look at a link between the advocacy and representation elements and the reform piece and the impact on the condition of women more generally in Rwanda, I would cite that as an example.
Great. Don't feel like you have to add to it, but if you'd like to.
I think that's fine.
Okay, great. Economic, would you like me to rephrase the question one more time? Would you like me to rephrase the question, or you're good with it?
Property rights. Property, of course, is an economic asset. Therefore, the question is whether property rights are part of women's economic empowerment or part of women's political empowerment. And that's where I do agree absolutely, is that having women owning property is fundamental to their empowerment. Without property, obviously they cannot influence. This is about power. Empowerment is about power. And it is, in this particular case, when it comes to gender equality, it's about shifting power from one part of society to another part of society. And of course, ownership, inheritance, property is key to it. But these are economic assets.
Please.
Not too long ago, I was involved in evaluating impact of a particular program that involved a woman living in Nairobi, a widow who was trying to build a business. And she had what we would call a working capital problem. She had a good stream of orders, but she had trouble keeping the cash flowing enough to pay for materials and stuff. And the obvious thing to do in the United States, if you had a situation like this, would be go to the bank and get a revolving line of credit. In Kenya, however, the practice is the banks only loan if you've got title to land to offer as collateral. And the problem is that less than 1% of the titled land in Kenya is owned by women. And the reason for that is millennia of inheritance rules, all right, that keep land going from one male to another and cutting the women out. That lands in the present moment as lack of access to capital. But you can see that what is happening to this woman is a place, a sort of a joint in the power structure, right? Where the inheritance laws and the history are joining up with the bank regulations in supposedly objective criteria that keep her from having access to credit. So I would just want to underscore what Irene said, which is that it's not just about the title of land, and it's certainly not just about getting credit. It is about understanding how the power structure comes together to perpetuate itself.
Okay, great. I'm going to go to the political team now. Democracy, especially in newly form democracies certainly does not ensure political participation at equal or even near equal levels between men and women. Can you give an example of when a country made great strides in leveling the playing field and how it made a difference to women's empowerment?
Yeah, I think the remarkable story I mentioned earlier is Tunisia, where the role of women over the last 4 years has ensured that not only their constitution, but many of the laws that are now in place are empowering women, giving women the right to divorce, banning polygamy, guaranteeing parity in all elected assemblies, giving access and a right to education, to credit and property rights, making Tunisia the first country in the Arab world to give women the right to be a president. And now 31% of parliament is held by seats of women. This has been lauded, and I think the international community, the World Bank and the UN and many international NGOs deserve a tremendous amount of credit for supporting this. But it was the women of Tunisia who fought their way into the discussions around the development of a constitution. They forced their way in the room politically to have a voice in the making of that constitution. And this constitution is now held up as the single most progressive constitution regarding women's rights in the 21st century.
And I'll tailor that question to you guys a bit for the economic team. So democracy does not necessarily ensure economic participation at an equal or even near equal levels between men and women. Look at the United States, yes? So can you give an example when a country made great strides in leveling the playing field? It can be from the developing world or non-developing world, and how it made a difference to women's empowerment.
In terms of the legal system doing it, or the political system doing it, or
Economics. Economically.
Okay. I actually think the United States is a good example. I think that the advent of the modern economy in the United States, together with the concept of democracy, a basic idea of fairness, and then probably along with the beginning of widespread literacy and open media, freedom of the press, brought about an idea that, you know what, things should be fair. And I'm not saying we're there, we are so not there, okay? But this was a radical idea in its time, a really radical idea, and there have been extraordinary strides made in this country. And I think that idea is still very much an inspiration to a lot of people, including a lot of women.
Would you like to add anything, or you?
Well, there are many examples, of course, in the developed world where democracy and economic empowerment have come together in progress for women. Look at Northern Europe, the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, even the UK and others. There are many good examples, but when you look at developing countries, you also find very interesting statistics which show that it is not necessarily the ones that are making the most economic progress or growth that are necessarily the ones where women are doing well. But the ones where women are doing well economically, economic empowerment of women actually depends on good policies. And you see that happening, that a country like Bangladesh is number 69 on the World Economic Forum gender index, whereas China is 61. Compare China's economic power and look at Bangladesh. So you can see that what we're really talking about is good policy making.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's go to the political team again. When the World Bank came out with its groundbreaking Voice and Agency report last year, one of the things it revealed was that countries where girls can receive an education, they are far better off. And they become far better off as women. Is the pathway to girls receiving an education political or economic empowerment? And if you can give an example, that would be great.
I think that the key issue on this is that as Irene said, you have to have good policies to support a surge in girls' education. But the research that we have, and actually the best research, is a long-term study of women's engagement in local council elections in India, shows that not only, as Shari mentioned earlier, do the policy choices and the decision-making change and shift to more public and social goods investments, but the example of the women in the political arena manages to change the perceptions of parents around their own girl children and what their girl children can expect from life. So there is a very strong and dynamic link there. Our challenge, if you like, is that we don't have enough similar studies to make similar kinds of judgments. But I think that one does certainly point to the impact that political engagement through greater education and the example that sets, not only in terms of how the women are using the power in the political realm, but also in terms of shifting some of the perceptions of the gendered roles that women and men undertake. That is a powerful example.
Just add one brief comment to that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sandra, but I think that study on Indian women, the increased number of Indian women in local governments saw a direct correlation to the increase in budget spending on education. And so, again, not enough data globally to draw that conclusion anywhere else or many other places, but I think that would be something we would look for if we were to do more research, is that the increased representation in legislatures, is there a correlation to an increase in budget priorities on health, education, and social issues?
Thank you. You want me to repeat the question, or? Okay. So, give an example of how, where's the name? Say yes. I'm sorry. Give an example of how economic empowerment improves. Yes, this was. I lost my place. I apologize. Give an example of how economic empowerment improves women's. Yeah, I'm sorry. I apologize. Yes, sorry. Apologies. Okay. So when the World Bank came out with its groundbreaking Voice and Agency report last year, it revealed that countries where girls can receive education are far better off. Is the pathway to girls receiving the education economic empowerment? And if so, how? Okay.
So I'm part of the team at Oxford that has been working on the question for a number of years now of whether or not if you provide free sanitary pads to poor rural schoolgirls, they'll stay in school longer. And we spend a lot of time in the way out there studying this. And I would have to say that I really feel after all this time, and I think most people who study it would agree with me, that the biggest barrier to girls getting an education is the threat that they will be married off early. And that what is behind that is essentially the belief that the investment in education is never going to pay off, that girls really are not worth much economically, all right, or especially if there's bride price or dowry involved, there's a calculation that has to do with how much I'm either going to get if I sell her, or how much I'm going to sell her into marriage, essentially, or how much I'm going to have to pay to get rid of her. And my feeling is, and perhaps this is sort of a poignant hope, but my feeling is that the economic empowerment that's important here is to be able to make the girls get to a situation where they can earn, and so their investment in their education looks like it will produce a return. And this is why I think economic empowerment will add to girls' education.
Want to add anything? Okay, so I think we have time for one last question before closing remarks, and this question will be, I'll go with the economic team first. Can you give an example of how economic empowerment can improve women's agency, and by that I mean women's ability to make decisions and act on it independently, act on these decisions independently?
Well, there are so many examples from our own lives. Because we have a paycheck, there are so many things that we can do that we wouldn't be able to do if we didn't have it. But there are many, I'm not an economist, but the economists, including the World Bank's own publications, will give you all the examples of how women's economic empowerment have led to improving their own, not only their own situation, but the situation of their daughters, in terms of investing in their daughters' education, in terms of being able to buy a cooking pot for the family, or being able to improve the housing and so on. There are just so many examples that show how empowerment, economic empowerment of women can actually lead to poverty reduction. And there are statistics that actually show that countries like Ghana, for example, have done better than even countries like China in terms of percentage bringing down poverty because of women being able to invest in their earnings into their families and into the
Great, I'm going to turn that question over to the political team, whoever would like to take that, but if you can give an example or two of how political empowerment can improve women's agency, improves their ability to make decisions and act on them in their daily lives independently.
Well, I think, for us, again, the issue is about your ability to influence and change the public policy space. And I think, somebody like Emmeline Pankhurst, why is the issue of suffrage, why is the issue of enfranchisement, why is the issue of engagement in politics such a keen one, not only for women? The whole civil rights movement is based on the issue of inclusion and being able to impact and influence the political realm in your own conscience for your own interests over time. And I think in that respect, if we lose that connection, or the reality of that political power, which is in a democratic system definitely delivered through the ballot box, and the UK is in the grip of election fever, so we know what we're talking about. As recently, I think there's going to be an upsurge in interest even here with a very strong bid from a lady whose name we shan't repeat, but certainly there's a possibility for a huge change in the agency of women, given the stand that a particular leader might well take on the back of her previous track record.
Okay, so before we ask you to vote again, and I'm going to do something a little bit different, but I'm going to ask each team to have a few concluding remarks, and I think this time I'm going to ask Linda Scott to, if you can sum up. It's your chance to say anything you want to. Economic empowerment and why it matters.
So, the first legal codes emerged in the ancient Middle East as a result of a new technology, writing, that actually was invented in order to track the movement of goods. It was, in fact, the thing that laid the foundation for what we now call the financial system. And in those early legal codes, women's status was codified as more or less belonging to men in one of three categories: slavery, prostitution, or marriage. And those codes stipulated that women would have extremely limited political and economic rights, and that if they stepped outside of any of those restrictions, restrictions that would be punished with extreme violence. And most of this kind of a system was, including the economics, was administered out of the temples, which is where the writing was also held very close to the vest, and women were not allowed to learn it. So all of these things, the law, the economy, the religion, the knowledge, the violence, and the families were all knitted together very, very tightly and clamped down really hard, and they have kept the lid on women for 5,000 years. So the idea that we're going to pull any one of these apart to set the women free is foolish. I think everybody on this panel already knows that, but we're trying to make a good drama here. We have a window here. The women's movement tends to go in spurts, as is often remarked. There'll be a window and then it will shut. This is by far the biggest and most breathtaking window the world has ever seen for women. And we need to not waste the time on a turf war, right? It is going to take every institution that built the gender divide to pitch in to tear it down. And that's what we need to focus on.
I wish Linda had been the one to close this, because I think that those are wonderful comments. I would just ask each one of you to close your eyes and think about not being able to go to the bank and open a bank account, or not being able to go to the bank and get a loan for your education, to buy a house, to do whatever you need to do, or not having the right to an education, or not being able to call the police and report that your partner, your spouse, your husband beat you up. We can't imagine that world, but in fact, that's where most of the women around the globe live. We have got rights, and we have a rule of law that protects those rights, because we have made political decisions in this country and in much of the developing world that those rights are critical to our society.